In round one of the Biel Grandmaster tournament, Magnus Carlsen defeated David Navarre in typical style in a long game where Navarre finally cracked. In round two, Magnus Carlsen faced Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the battle of the greats, Maxime against Magnus. This was also a very long game. I'm going to go through the whole thing, but I'm going to just focus on a few key moments. Otherwise, we could be there a long time. So first of all, Magnus with the black pieces played the Peert's defense. Now, that is pretty unusual at top level. So Carlsen obviously just trying to get Maxime out of his normal tram lines. He's a great theoretician. In fact, they've both worked together. Vachier-Lagrave was part of Carlsen's team in the last World Championship, and I believe they're continuing their collaboration for this forthcoming match in November. Well, it's quite interesting that Vachier-Lagrave wasn't phased, and very quickly he played this move bishop f4, and this is a little bit unusual. But, well, Carlsen didn't have any great problems in negotiating this. It's not such a dangerous way. I think bishop h6 in this position is the way to play if one wants to get something from the opening, but it's nothing special, really. And they quickly reached an endgame. And at first glance, I was thinking that, well, perhaps White has a slight advantage in this position. It's, you could say, a typical French pawn structure with this pawn on e5 and the pawn on d5. This is the first very interesting moment in the game, because I was commentating live in this position and I was trying to find some way to keep this bishop in the game. Normally, when this bishop is locked in the French, then this becomes the bad bishop. So I was looking at things like bishop f5 and sacrificing this pawn, or maybe rook d8, or maybe even just bishop e6 to keep that bishop so that it has possibilities to come into the game later on this diagonal. But they're all problematic in some ways. It's very interesting. Magnus played e6, and this was actually brilliant judgment, as we'll see. So at first I thought, well, this looks crazy, he's shutting in his bishop. But actually what Magnus has realized is that because the pawn on e5 doesn't have support from the pawn on f4, it's actually very difficult for White to organize his kingside counterplay. So first of all, you can see that Maxime brought his rook over to support the pawn in the middle of the board. And now what Carlsen is doing is just developing his play on the queen side, and this is classic French strategy. You can see it's much clearer now. We have basically a French pawn structure on the board, and when you have that, then this advance on the queen side is absolutely standard and positionally very strong indeed. Now, the trick for black in this position, because it seems as though White has good control in the center with those bishops, but the trick is to exchange those bishops off. And in fact, in this kind of pawn structure, once those bishops are exchanged, then black gets very nice play down the c file. This one is coming soon to exchange the other bishop off. So here, basically, White needs counterplay on the king side. So both players setting in train their plan. So this bishop is coming around to c5. And of course, Maxime realized that, and he played g4, opening up the king side. Now this is the next very important moment. How Maxime played now is probably not bad, but perhaps the best thing to do is to play h5 and just to crack open the king like this. Now black is certainly not worse here, but let me just give you an illustration of what could possibly happen here. So black gets his counterplay down the c file, here with those lovely rooks. You can see that pawn, that's the point of advancing this pawn so that black has this kind of minority attack and can press down the c-file. But white has sufficient counterplay in this position. And this is a very important move. White needs to ram the f pawn forward. But first of all, you need to duck back, defends the pawn, gets out of this pin, and black doesn't have time to play rook takes pawn because of rook h8 check. And after king here, f5, that gives white sufficient counterplay. In this position, it's about equal. So h5 would have been the clearest move. But instead, Vachier-Lagrave played a little bit more conservatively, just taking off that pawn first on g4. Carlsen moved the king into the middle, very sensible. And this is a key moment. Maxime said after the game that he'd underestimated this move rook c4. And again, this is quite typical for this kind of French structure position, that the rook comes into play along the fourth rank, sometimes comes into e4, sometimes there's just continued pressure down the c-file, but this just pegs white back for a moment. In fact, white is still fine. So Vachier-Lagrave continued to open up the position. The king came into the middle. There we are. Carlsen ducking the king behind this core French pawn structure. This is why the French can be such a powerful opening, because you have that solid core of pawns that protects the king, well, protects everything actually, and black plays around that. Here is an important moment. In fact, white can equalize the position with rook h6, a very difficult move to spot. And the idea is that the rook comes to f6, guards the f pawn, and then you move the rook into g7. And well, I don't think that black can get any advantage in this position. If the rook moves away, then, for example, f5 with the rook on f8. So passively placed, I think white is absolutely fine in this position. But instead, Vachier-Lagrave played rook h4, so he's still intent on pushing the f pawn forward, and he's protected that rook. But now the rook comes in on the g file, and this is fantastically strong. And it's at this moment that basically Carlsen takes charge of the game, because white's king is in some trouble here. King has to go back. So basically Vachier-Lagrave is counting on counterplay with this f pawn. He wants to try and break through on f7, and this is extremely dangerous. Rook takes b4. I think it's understandable that he went in for this line. This looks much more attractive than, well, I don't know about as an alternative to rook f6 that we saw earlier, but this one somehow is an obvious variation to calculate, so why would you look elsewhere? And at first glance, it seems as though white has enough in this position. But Magnus's next move was excellent. Yes, he has these wonderful rooks on the second rank, but there is a problem with this pawn. But he just pushed with a5. And white, of course, can take the f pawn. But in this position, black is actually winning. And it's very instructive. First of all, you can see two different checkmates are threatened here. So white has to bring the king across. So then we give a check, and this is nice as well. Now black has not repeated the position. He's moved the rook basically from g2 to f2 with gain of tempo. The rook stands behind the pawn. The king still has to come over. And the king has to come over to avoid mate. Mate threatened here on the back rank. So white's rook has to come back. And now the advance of the d-pawn is actually decisive. Let me just go a little bit further. And d3 followed by d2. I mean, there are still a few more details there, but basically black is winning that position. So after a5, rook b8 played. And this is still fantastically complicated. But let me go on. So the rook comes behind the f-pawn, and obviously mate is threatened on the back rank. So king e1. And now this is a really interesting moment, because what Vachier-Lagrave is trying to do is bring the rook to the back rank here and start to hassle black's king. But Carlsen had this under control. He simply advanced his king up the board, and if rook h8, then king c5, the king comes into d4. It's still protected by that wonderful core of pawns, and once it dives into white's position, then it can even help with a checkmating attack, but of course it might just help taking all those center pawns as well. So after king c6, rook c8 check. Now I'm just going to wind forward with these moves, but you can see well, that d-pawn coming forward, and of course that would be fatal, so Vachier-Lagrave has to try to trade rooks, but Carlsen avoids that. The king is still stuck on the back rank, so rook f4. So the rook has dived back, but he basically wants to, one thing, take that pawn and also advance the d-pawn. And notice that this rook is still perfectly placed behind the f-pawn. But of course it's so complicated now that black has to deal with this far advanced pawn. Rook takes e5. So at least that f-pawn doesn't have the protection of a pawn. And now, in fact, well, Magnus took the pawn on f6. In fact, it looks like d3 is the most straightforward way to win this position. Well, here's one very simple line. If rook d7, then rook d5 exchanges the rook. And because the king is cut here, then white can't actually defend this position. Now, there are more details to that, but basically Magnus must have missed some move in his calculation. Or maybe he just assumed d3 wasn't working and snapped off that pawn very quickly. Who knows? I mean, it's such a complicated position. It's impossible to play it perfectly. Okay, let me move on rapidly because we still have many moves to go in this game. Still some adventures to come. But basically this rook needed to come back to guard the second rank before white checked there. And Magnus pinning his hopes on this d-pawn. Now this isn't going to go through when there's a rook behind it, but this pawn is going to be used as a decoy. And there we go, the rook comes behind. Now if the rook moves down here to protect the d-pawn, then of course white is going to just give perpetual check here, back and forth. So, but of course Magnus had intended giving up the pawn and taking on b2. So in a sense the position has cleared again. We're into the next phase of this tricky position. Black is still a pawn up. Crucially, white's king is miles away from the action. But with 4 rooks on the board, it is still so complicated. I mean, many top players say that rook and pawn endgames are the most difficult endgames. I would agree with that, but I would also say double rook endings are perhaps even more complicated. So rook takes pawn. Right, next crucial moment, because of course white can take that pawn on e6, But in fact, in this position, after rook b2, followed by the advance of this pawn, the king is just too far away. So it means that white can't take that. So first of all, Maxime tries to bring his king a little bit closer. And with 4 rooks on the board, the king can still be hassled as well. And it's not clear whether black should be trying to hang on to this pawn. Well, he is for the moment. Or, you know, how you make progress here. But, well, rook b2 is a good start anyway. It means that the a pawn can advance sometimes, and perhaps you can come back to b6 with the rook. Rook b3 hassles the king, and now the a pawn advances so that with the rook here the pawn can be supported. And rook a6. Now this one we need to keep, because if white can take that, then his king will be much closer to the e pawn. So that's protected like this. If rook takes pawn, then actually the rooks can cover, and they can also hassle the king. This is very dangerous. We're back to checkmating attacks here, and then the king can advance up the board. Could be that, you know, we play a move like rook c5. Could be that rook b2 is actually winning, because the king prevents white's rook from coming behind the b pawn. So the game, rook check. In fact, black's king can escape these checks. It can just dive around the other side of the pawn. Now, black shouldn't protect this pawn with rook f6, because then white goes back for the a pawn, but instead this pawn is given up. The king can always just come back towards the queen side, and can always escape the checks, because that was a clever move, playing the rook back earlier. And now we reach the crunch moment in the game, where finally black has consolidated his position actually, and white has to fall back on the defensive. It took a long time, but we're there. Very important moment in the game. Carlsen was playing very freely at this moment, and very quickly he found this important move, rook h3, and this demonstrates a typical tactic in rook and pawn endgames. If rook takes rook, pawn takes, threatening to get a queen, rook b6. Now if this pawn is just defended with, say, a rook check, then the king will wander over and can help to take that pawn. But the tactic that wins in this position is rook h1. Very sweet, absolutely typical. Threatening to make a queen, and if rook takes pawn, then rook check wins a rook. That's a nice skewer. So rook h3, a very, very important move. And here, really, white doesn't have a defense. The game went like this: king g2, rook check, and a2. Now, of course, Carlsen had to calculate this out, because it only works by tempo. He's just one move ahead. This is really important. If the rook moves, then the king will approach the pawn and it'll be a draw. But king b7 wins a crucial tempo. King e3, and the king advances again. And once again, a crucial tempo. Really, really important. And white could not avoid this. If the rook had gone to the third rank, well, you can see there would have been a skewer. So the rook goes here. And after king b4, in fact, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave resigned the game. Very interesting that Magnus played these last 10 moves or so practically instantly. You know, he had this ending absolutely at his fingertips. There's no defense here. First of all, if white waits, then we can give a check and play rook a3. And if rook b8 check, then the king just steps forward, and here, and you can see if there's another check, then the black rook shields and no defense here. So absolutely right, after king b4, white is completely lost. Another extraordinary endgame performance from Magnus Carlsen, and he really does enjoy grinding out these positions. Fascinating struggle. So after 2 rounds in the Biel Grandmaster tournament, Carlsen is in the lead with 2 out of 2, and that was a big game, winning with the black pieces against one of his big rivals in the tournament.